This is RealAg Live. And welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. I hope you're having yourselves a great day. Hope you had yourself a great Easter weekend as well. I know I did for sure. Hey, today we're going to have a lot of fun talking about some science-based stuff, some very, very important topics when it comes to the products that you're able to use on your farm. A big decision last week by Health Canada that I'm not sure if you heard about, but we're going to definitely discuss it today and why it's important and how does it all relate to science-based decision-making. We throw that phrase out a lot. What does it actually mean? Maybe we saw evidence of it for sure last week. If you want to participate in this discussion, all you have to do is enter your comment, your question in the box, whether you're watching on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook. And like I said, really appreciate you joining us. We are live, so you can ask our guests some questions. Feel free to do so. We love when you participate. This is not some recorded webinar we recorded last week, and now we're going to play for you. No, we are live in person. Let's bring in today's guest. It is Pierre Patel. He is president and CEO of CropLife Canada, based out of Ottawa. Pierre, how are you doing? I'm
doing great. How are you, Shaun?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. Great to chat with you for sure. So how's the weather in Ottawa? Did you have a good Easter weekend?
We did. It's the sun was shining and you could see signs of spring and stuff's growing out of the garden. So yeah, it's definitely a little bit of positive news for a change, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the Health Canada decision last week regarding neonics. Break it down for us. How does CropLife Canada see the decision that Health Canada made?
Well, I mean, it's tremendously positive for many sectors of ag. There are a few sectors that are going to be waking up with a bit of a different take on the news. Certain horticulture crops have seen their uses significantly impacted, significantly restricted, and to the point of potentially not even having alternatives. So for onion production and a few other crops, there's some major issues ahead for them. On the broadacre crops, though, on the canola and the cereals, tremendous news, because you'll recall that in 2018, the proposed decision, based on the review, was to restrict all outdoor agricultural uses. So let that sink in. All outdoor agricultural uses. That was what was on the table. And so for us, it was, let the process play out, answer the scientific questions that you have, Health Canada, with the data that you need, and then make your decision. And that looks like what happened this time.
Yeah, think about, you're right. Think about the significance of that. All agricultural uses. That would have left canola really in a tight spot with not a lot of alternative options out there.
Precisely. And people often ask me, depending on which stripe of color of government is in the down the road here, um, how political, or what's the impact of the liberals in power, for example, to crop protection. What I always say is that we're fortunate in Canada because we have a science-based system, and the regulator is isolated and insulated from that political sort of lens. So even if individual people in Parliament have views about pesticides or GMOs, it doesn't really translate into the regulators that we're seeing, because they follow a scientific protocol. They follow a process that does take the weight of scientific evidence. And so, what we contrast that with Europe, where anything to do with agriculture is so politically laced that I mean, the science is, I mean, they ignore their scientists openly and without any apology on a regular basis. And so what we have here is a far cry from that.
So how does Health Canada go about this? Because, a lot of times we're asked on these consults to provide letters of support and telling, how this impacts us. But at the end of the day, it does come down to the science. And so how do they look at all these different pieces and come up with a decision?
Yeah, you're right. And if the data had showed them that, in this case, it was aquatic insects was the issue. If the data had showed them that no matter how important the compounds are to canola growers or to wheat growers or others, if the risk is too great for that population of the insects, they would have restricted it anyway. Like, it's not sort of a cost benefit. What they do is they say if the risks are unacceptable, then the product cannot be registered anymore. And so what they were doing was, they didn't have a lot of water monitoring data from the prairies. They had subsets of data from Ontario and Quebec, which showed some high levels and some spikes, which they couldn't pinpoint the source of. And so they had to assume that these were regularly occurring, and that they were occurring in other streams and water and wetlands across Canada. And they plug it into models that, simulation models that spit out a scenario and a probability of risk. And that's where they came up with their initial decision, or proposed decision.
So what
And
does
so,
it,
yeah.
oh, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so what happened is the industry, so the registrants who own the products, the canola council, growers, provincial governments, all jumped in and said, okay, tell us what you're missing to really answer your question. And they generated some very, very high quality water monitoring data from regions across the prairies. And what those data obviously showed, I mean, we haven't seen them, but what those data obviously showed is that real life data aren't showing a problem, aren't showing the high levels that they were predicting with their modeling. And so they will always take real data over computer modeling any day. So if they have it, they'll use it, and it has to be of a certain quality. And in this case, it was very high quality, and they could use it in their actual decision.
So what does it mean for horticulture growers across the country? You said in some of these cases there's not alternative uses. So what happens now?
Well, we saw some of that with the other complicating factor is the neonics decisions are being, you'll notice that every year or so there seems to be a new decision. It's because they've broken it out into chunks. So last year the decision was on pollinators, and that pollinator decision allowed the continued use, but removed a lot of orchard use and crops where there's, in bloom, remove those uses. And in this case, aquatic insect, removing some in furrow uses for potatoes. They're removing, like I said, onions already, a few other crops where, in their estimation, the risks are too great for aquatic insects. And so what does it mean? I mean, some of these crops are already in pretty rough shape in terms of alternatives, right? They've got tremendous pest pressures, even much more so than some of the broadacre crops, and not a lot of options in many cases. And so this will be a challenge for some of them.
Now, you mentioned they've broken this out. This one was about aquatic insects. Is there upcoming future, like, sort of verticals to be looked at in regards to neonics that are coming up?
Yeah, so the next one is imidacloprid, and it's on the whole compound. And so
Okay.
that decision is expected sometime this spring. The other two, the clothianidin and thiamethoxam, they're also under full reevaluation, and those final decisions are expected, in the coming. I don't know the exact time frame. However, the two areas of sort of heightened concern and attention have been the pollinators and the aquatic insects, and with those two sort of parts of the reevaluation completed through these processes, it bodes. I don't want to predict and I don't want to presuppose, but it sort of does predict that there's a good likelihood that the rest of the compound, the rest of the uses will be okay. The health aspects of neonics have never been an issue. The toxicity has never been an issue. It's really been around, can you protect non-target insects, and whether they're pollinators or insects in the water.
Now, in the case of corn and soybeans, there is some restriction on use, but in the case of soybeans, they've kind of moved past neonics. They found other alternatives to control some of these pests, correct?
Yeah, I think. It's always important to keep as many tools in the toolbox, right? Because that old you don't want to go through a treadmill where you kind of everyone switches to the new stuff, and then you end up with resistance issues and that. But I think overall, it looks manageable, but there are some questions, and we haven't sort of dug too deeply in or spoken to our corn grower colleagues yet as to what the impacts will mean in the field. For example, for reducing the rate on corn below the rate that works for corn rootworm. What does that mean for the practicality of that compound moving forward? So there are some questions. It's not black and white. Yes, for canola and cereals, it was a vindication. It was a good day for those crops for sure. I think corn and soybeans there's still some analysis and questions to be asked.
Okay, you also have a consult going on at Health Canada, busy space over there at Health Canada. They're looking at gene editing. Now, this is something that is also very, very important to some of the members at CropLife. Why is gene editing such an important thing in terms of the future of plant breeding?
Yeah, great question, Shaun. The consultation is actually on the whole way plant breeding is assessed. And so whether you're doing conventional breeding or gene editing or GMOs, this pertains to you. And basically it's providing some better clarity and some new approaches to how those products are evaluated and what triggers which type of review. And it's taken us several years to get to this stage, and we're cautiously optimistic because the consultation document, what they're proposing, there's some work around the margins and some things that we're going to, push back on a little bit, but the concept itself is pretty good, and we're in a good space compared to where we were, several months ago, and we're pretty good when we look at where other countries have already sort of surpassed us in their clarity of direction to the innovators, and so we're we're in a good place, I think, with Health Canada anyway.
Now, you mentioned some countries have moved past us. How have they moved past us? Well,
we've seen when gene editing. So let me just back up a bit. We started these conversations with Health Canada and CFIA. This goes back 6-7 years ago. So we saw these technologies coming. We knew our regulatory system wasn't really ready for them, and so we tried to sort of till the ground before the technologies came. And it took us a few years just to get sort of recognition that there was a problem to be solved. So that took some time. And then once the awareness was there, that our recognition that there was something to be solved, then sort of how far they were wanting to go. And so that took another few years. And so, to their credit, they did, they convened a science panel. They've moved in a very positive way in the last year or so. But what I mean by other countries is, we saw the US make very clear statements about that if gene editing if the trait that you bring forward through gene editing could have been generated through traditional plant breeding, then we're not going to treat it any differently than traditional plant breeding. And the USDA made that statement probably going back 18 months now, maybe longer, and sent a very clear signal to the innovators that if that's the case and you meet that criteria, you're free to innovate and bring those crops to the US. And so other countries have done similar things, Argentina, Australia, a few other parts of the world. And they provided that clarity that we didn't have. And so what we saw is that, believe it or not, we had Canadian companies, innovators in Canada, that were launching their product for the first time in the US and ramping up their acreage in the US. And so the value added that we keep talking about for these very specialized crops, well, that's going to happen in the US where these crops are being grown, not in Canada. And so we push those levers pretty hard with government to sort of say, we've got to get our act together. Otherwise, we're going to miss this innovation boat here, and the US is going to be the primary winner.
And Canada wants to be competitive in this space. So when Health Canada is going through these evaluations, do they look at what decision the U.S. made and how they got to that conclusion at USDA, or do we make our decision completely like in our own Canadian bubble? Like how does that work?
Yeah, I think on the crop protection side, Canada and the U.S. have been global leaders in sort of work sharing and harmonizing data requirements and really striving towards a better sort of more collaborative approach where you're not getting sort of black and white differences between the two approaches. On plant breeding, I'd say we're quite a bit further behind. And so, yes, the way you described it is pretty much the way it is. It's Canada's approach, and it doesn't really matter what the U.S. has done or any other jurisdiction, frankly.
Okay. So now on things like gene editing with like CRISPR-Cas9, or what did the organic industry decide? I sometimes get some of this mixed up, so I'll ask some of the questions for the audience they may be thinking. Can it be classified as organic?
No, I think again, I can't speak to that sector, with authority, but I know early days that industry was actually quite split, and there were some that were saying, look, these aren't GMOs, these are just sort of traditional breeding, but more precise. And then there were others that were saying, no, this is just another version of GMOs. And so I think the final outcome is that the anti-GMO folks have won out on that debate, and I think the organic industry has abandoned the ability of that technology of helping the organic sector.
So if you have gene editing and it's not classified in some cases as GM, boy, that creates a whole nother discussion and education point with the consumer on what exactly it is, right? Like it's kind of like, it's not no man's land, but it's an interesting place in the middle.
Yeah, and even our industry has been sort of struggling a little bit with, okay, we want to make sure that we're clear that this is not the same as GMO, but at the same time, GMOs are perfectly safe, and they've got tremendous market penetration. So we don't want to disparage GMOs, which are going to be here for quite a while, in order to sort of bring in gene editing. So we've been walking a bit of a fine line there. But I think there have been some learnings from how GM was introduced, and I think the industry recognizes that it focused very heavily on sort of the farmer benefits and didn't really consider the consumer in the equation, right? It's like, well, no, this is to help production practices on the farm. So I think there's some learnings there. And so we're really, we've launched an initiative called Nature Nurtured. You'll see it on Twitter. You'll see it on LinkedIn and a few other spots. And it's really aimed at that consumer who doesn't understand agriculture or pay a lot of attention to this type of stuff. And it's really it's a lighthearted kind of approach. It's a new approach for us to really explain something that's not simple. It is complicated. So if people have questions, naturenurture.ca, and again, like, you'll see it on social media, and it might be helpful in terms of getting those consumers to understand a little bit better what it means and what the potential might be.
Because, Pierre, at the end of the day, like, I think a lot of times we focus on the people that are, like, sort of their opinions are set in stone on either side of some of these debates. And there's a whole bunch of people in the middle that don't know. They're curious. They wonder how they're supposed to think about these things. They ask their friends, that come over for a glass of wine, or they ask a family member. They just would like to know how they should feel about it, right? And so that's why there are some of these programs and websites like you just mentioned to try to help people come to some conclusions.
Yeah, and I think you hit it right on the head there, because our polling consistently shows that there's a 30 to 40%, sometimes even more, of the population that hasn't actually made up their minds on these technologies, don't have real concerns, that doesn't keep them up at night, but they can be swayed one way or the other. And so I think it's important for the ag sector to kind of send, a consistent and clear message about the need for innovation, the challenges we have with, climate change, and pest pressures are not going away. We need constant kind of new innovations and solutions in order to keep growing and to keep feeding the world.
Absolutely. Kara's got a question here in terms of how the general public reacts to when Health Canada makes a decision. When Health Canada gives the stamp of approval on something, does it tend to quiet the concerned folks in the sector, or people in general?
So that is a great question. I think that the people, like I just described, as they've heard maybe about neonics and bees. I mean, it was so prominent a few years ago. Hearing that Health Canada has said the issue is put to bed, that this is not of concern for aquatic insects. Yes, for a good chunk of the population, it does have a tremendous impact. For those whose livelihoods depend on concern and some of the activist groups, no, this does not. And we've seen some pretty strong media the last few days criticizing Health Canada. And these are, the irony is that the same people that were praising Health Canada on their proposed decision, saying they've listened to the science and they didn't let the companies sort of sway them and were, good job, Health Canada. Now, 3 years later, they're describing them as incompetent and having switched sides and all this nonsense, right? So those groups really, the controversy is really what keeps them in the media. The controversy is what keeps the donations coming in. And I know I'm being a bit flippant, but it really is it's a well-known model, and you see these groups jump on anytime there's an issue. When glyphosate became a hot topic, suddenly they were all glyphosate crusaders. When the pollinator issue became a hot topic, they were all suddenly, their job was to save the bees, and they needed your funding to do so. So there are groups that will challenge this and push Health Canada on this decision, but it's a final decision, so we're good.
Yeah, and I think I saw this during the USMCA NAFTA negotiations, where some people jump to the conclusion, depending on who the government is in place, that they don't realize that a lot of those people stay in those positions, no matter who is the government, right? And so that's something that I think a lot of people don't really realize as well.
Yeah, and in some countries, the changeover goes down quite a few layers.
Yeah.
Here, it's the ministers, obviously, and sometimes deputies get shuffled around. But everyone else is not a political appointment. Everyone else is a bureaucrat, and I worked in government, and when I worked couple of years, I was under a Liberal minister, and a couple of years before that, I was under a Conservative minister. It didn't change how we worked or did the science, right?
So, Pierre, we've talked about what's going on with the plant breeding. We've talked about the decision last week when it comes to neonics and aquatic insects. Are there any other files that the audience should really have on their radar and be paying attention to, things that you're working on behind the scenes in these regards?
Yeah, maybe on the plant breeding innovation consultation, one of the things that there are clearly still groups out there. I mentioned a few on the chemistry side, but there are groups out there that have a very strong anti-GMO bent, and they've lumped gene editing with that, and so they've got a campaign going to get people to write into the minister during this consultation and write into the consultation itself, saying that that we're wary of gene editing and we don't want these products on the market, and so on and so forth. So what we've partnered with a number of groups, including Grains Council, canola growers, and grain growers on a campaign called Advancing Agriculture, and it's really just to help offset a little bit. We don't want to get into this sort of how many letters versus how many letters they got, but I think for ag to show its presence and to show that farmers and people involved in agriculture, and even if you're not a farmer and you just you're a rural Canadian, or someone who depends on agriculture, that send in a message. It's very simple and automated on that Advancing Ag landing page, and it I think it's an opportunity for agriculture to really counterbalance that sort of grassroots approach that has been fairly successful for the activists to at least raise questions and maybe slow things down in the past when they do so. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. I think the other thing too is people often ask about what are the trade implications, right? We're a trade dependent nation, and so what about these new technologies and trade? And that's a legitimate question, and we're not sweeping any of that under the rug. We're having those discussions with the traders. We're having the discussion at the Canada Grains Council, and we know there's going to be challenges in some jurisdictions. Europe is not likely to pivot on its approach to gene editing. Right now, they're classified as GM, the way the judicial system ruled that. There's some analysis happening right now, and potential some shifts coming, but they've got a very skeptical population there, and that's going to take some time and some challenges. So I think, from an exporting nation's perspective, we can't sort of let parts of the world that have an anti-technology bent to them sort of dictate what and where we innovate, but we can't ignore potential trade risks either, right? So we're working to make sure there's a balance there to put the right tools in the growers' hands, but also not negatively impacting our trade routes.
Does China have a stated position on gene editing?
Not. China's always got
it's always complicated.
It's always and they've always got a lot of wiggle room, and even in their stated positions. So, I might defer that answer, Shaun, because.
Well, it's a tough one, because some people would say that Canada's in a difference when we talk about technology approval and export markets. A country like the U.S. can sort of, because of the size and volume, they can sort of push their product around a little bit, or sort of bully it into the market, maybe is sort of a way to put that. Canada's a lot smaller nation, and that kind of probably factors a little bit more in our mentality. Plus, we've had a number of years of where these issues come up, and so maybe we're a little bit shell shocked too.
Yeah, fair enough, and I think it's all about the balance. We often say, if you go 100% risk averse, well, then you're slamming the door shut on innovation, and other countries are going to just take over and eat your lunch. If you go too much the other way and it's just innovation at all costs and to hell with the export markets, well, that's going to have potential major impacts for certain commodities. So it's a balance, and I think we've managed it fairly well to now, and I don't think gene editing will be any different.
Yeah, people's responses to technology is always interesting. Like, you throw in like the vaccine for COVID-19 into all that, and how people respond to that. Like, it's just there tends to be not consistency when people in some of these countries, like you brought up, like Europe, pushing the vaccine and wanting to get everybody vaccinated as much as possible, but then they have an issue with gene editing. And there seems to me anyway, that's not consistent with how you look at technology, but.
Yeah.
Hey, Pierre, one thing I didn't ask you about, on the gene editing and the Health Canada consultation with plant breeding, you have a website set up too where people can participate in that consult, do you not?
Yeah, so that's Advancing Agriculture I was talking about.
That's that website, okay.
Yeah, so if you just type in Advancing Ag, and again, that's also circulating on social media. Hopefully people are retweeting it and seeing it on LinkedIn. But yeah, Advancing Agriculture, and you can sign in, and it's just a place for general information and updates and positive news about agriculture. And then there is this sort of currently this campaign to get some letters into the thing. It's very simple. It copies your local MP. So whoever that is in your writing, he or she will also get a copy of your notes. So they may reach out and find out what's this all about. But this is it's a good thing.
Cool stuff. And Kara just messaged me and said we'll link to that website in the post when we post this on Real Agriculture as well. So, hey, Pierre, really appreciate you joining us here today. Very, very important work that CropLife's doing. Thank you for joining us and filling us in and giving us the details.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Shaun. Very much appreciated.
Hey, want to encourage everybody to check out RealAg Radio today, 4:30 Eastern. It is Agronomic Monday. We got some great conversations regarding trash management, seeding rates, and as well frost seeding. And what was the other one? Oh, we're going to talk about should you use a heavy harrow or just spread your residue off the combine. So some good stuff. Encourage everybody to check it out. Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Everybody have yourselves a great day. Thanks for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live. We'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.